Thank you again. So I always love to talk about the legal process in Canada by starting at the end, when the baby's born, because that's just the best place to start, isn't it? So, birth registration. As you may know, we are a federal government, so we have Ottawa that makes laws for certain areas, and the provinces and territories in other areas. And when they overlap, as you know, they fight a lot. And health is one of those, but registration and vital statistics is the purview of the provinces. So each province has its own legislation that says we must register marriages, divorce, births, and deaths. And the question becomes, how does one register a birth if someone else gave birth? How do we as intended parents become parents? So when I went through this, I was told that my lawyer was going to go to court here in Toronto and declare me to be the mother of my husband's child. And I said, say what? I should be the mother of my husband's child at birth. So I really wanted to see that change, and thanks to a whole bunch of people who worked really hard, that change developed in Ontario as well as in British Columbia. So in those two provinces, there is an administrative process called the Statutory Declaration, whereby paperwork is filled out, and it's always wise to have it done by a lawyer to make sure it's done properly. The paperwork is sent to the registry office, and birth certificates are issued in the name of the parent. It could be 1 or 2. In British Columbia, it could be up to 6, and in Ontario, up to 4. I'm not going to say anything about that. But in other provinces, and I hope they will join in other provinces, there is still a requirement of going to court. And that varies slightly from province to province as well. In some provinces, you're at the court within a few days, and you don't actually go. In some provinces, we drop off the materials to the judge's office. It's signed, we pick them up. You're declared the parents of your child, and the surrogate is declared not a parent. In some provinces, the surrogate is asked to actually register initially, and it's usually done right in the hospital. And then the judge will make the declaration that she in fact is not and only you are. And that birth certificate may be reissued within a matter of weeks in most cases. So there are many, many options available throughout the country. And the real issue is, where are the surrogates in those provinces, which is the best pick? Quebec is a kind of special territory because it, as one of the photo slides showed, Quebec does not recognize surrogacy. However, it's an adoption territory, and as Canadians, if your baby is born in Quebec to a surrogate there, you can legally adopt. And the Court of Appeal there has also said you could register solely as a father without the surrogate mother named. So there are options in Quebec. Sarah is going to talk about what goes into a contract, but briefly I want to address one of the slides that spoke about Quebec, or referenced Quebec not being, having enforceable surrogacy agreements. In fact, in most provinces, there is legislation that says the agreement itself is not enforceable, but may be used as evidence to show who was to be the parent and who is not. So in the some 30 years of surrogacy, we really don't see disputes over the parentage part. If there's a good contract in place and you've had good service providers, and if surrogates are supported by their agencies and support groups, you shouldn't have that problem at all. So Quebec is actually a pretty safe territory as well. Prince Edward Island still has legislation that says you can get a declaration in court, but for some reason Vital Statistics doesn't want to accept it. That's being challenged right now by the lawyer there. So right now she's still needing to do adoptions, but you can adopt as Canadians. Josh is going to talk to address later those of you who have crossed the border and have some immigration issues about bringing your Canadian baby home. And so I'll leave that to him. One of the things I also wanted to address before I hand it over to Sarah is the length of time it takes to get the birth registration and to do the contract process. So whether you're doing a statutory declaration or a court-ordered process, you should expect it to take about 3 weeks, sometimes 4. It all depends on you, the timing of your surrogate to sign things, how things are progressing. If your baby is born in another province, you can probably go home. Most airlines will allow you to fly home on day 7 with discharge papers. I think WestJet is even less. Or you drive home, it's not a problem, and the documentation can be sent to you and signed and FedExed, etc. Our office is generally seeing birth certificates issued between 2 and 2.5 weeks for Ontario. Now, regardless of whether it's a court order or administrative, there is one fundamental necessary item. That's the surrogacy contract. And as a part of that, it is fundamentally important, mandatory, that the surrogate have legal advice, independent from you. So I'm always asked, can you act for both of us? No. Independent means another law firm. So Sarah and I have often done surrogacy agreements. Shirley's also here, I've done them with her, and Terry from Josh's firm, we've done them together as well. But one of us acts for the surrogate, one acts for the intended parents. So in Ontario, in order to avail yourself of the administrative order, there must be a contract in place for that journey, for that baby. So you can't, if you're doing the second journey with your surrogate for the second baby, it's another contract with her again. But that doesn't mean everyone needs 5 hours of advice all over again, so it works out quite well. The contract is a really important process, and independent legal advice is one of the hallmarks in Canada of making sure that surrogates are not vulnerable and that you're not vulnerable as well. What you don't want is what I had for the first journey. So, what goes into a contract? Sarah's going to talk about it. There is some information about egg donor contracts as well that she's going to address. I want to quickly go over those. They are not legally mandatory in Canada the way the surrogacy contract is. And the need for them may depend on the agency or the clinic that you attend at. They all have their policies. I happen to think that they're a very good idea for a number of reasons, not to mention confidentiality. But most importantly, the donor is in her early 20s. Without getting legal advice, do we really think she can appreciate the long-term consequences of the amazing gift she gives? So we think it's a good idea that she gets advice, and I'd be hard-pressed to find a lawyer who would disagree with me. It usually sets out things like mutual disclosure of genetic illnesses in the future that may take place between her family, and your children, the offspring. Very important for us as parents. And the gender and birth date of all offspring, so that you can tell your children in the future there may be a half sibling out there, and we can find out later. So there are very good reasons. One of the slides says the difference between known and anonymous may be that anonymous is legally safer. I think that needs to be corrected with all due respect, because in most provinces there's actual legislation now that says a donor is not a parent. So the fact that you know her name and her address and her email address does not allow her to show up and claim your child, nor will it allow your child to show up on her doorstep and say, "Whoa, you're a famous actress, I want you to be my mommy now." That's not going to happen. So, of course, if you make a donor a part of your life and you allow her to develop a parental relationship, those are different issues. But in the third-party context, it's really not a concern whether she's anonymous or known. Personally, our donor is known and has met my children 3 times, and they ask me questions about her. I can answer them. I like that. But that's personal as opposed to legal. So with that in mind, and because we're running really, really late, I wanted to go into more detail, but please come see us, fill out forms so we can have consultations. I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to talk about what goes into the contracts. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Cindy. So my name is Sarah Cohen. My practice is Fertility Law Canada. More than happy to share information, but I only have a few minutes, so I'm going to do it pretty quickly right now. Speaking first, I'm going to speak about a surrogacy agreement because it's a lot more detailed, it's a lot longer of a process, and it's a relatively, they're usually about 40 pages in Canada, so it's a pretty significant document. I would say like, I don't know if 90% is a good guess, but I think about 90% of my work is heteronormative family building. So I'm very often telling people, you have to understand, you have a girlfriend for the next year or so. So a lot of thought has to go into this process. I was listening earlier today, and I was really touched actually to hear what Ron and what Frankie were saying in general, and Sherman, about men having babies, because the idea of ethics and the relationship between the parties keeps on coming up again and again. So I do apologize now if things that I'm going to say have been touched on already, but what I think it shows you is that the people here today have more or less the same kind of idea about what surrogacy should look like and what it can look like in Canada. So before I even talk to you about exactly what goes in, I do want everyone to take a step back and think about the socioeconomic realities of the people who choose to be surrogates in Canada. Because one of the questions I get all the time, and I'm sure everyone else in the room gets it all the time, if they don't know someone who's chosen to be a surrogate, why would someone do this for someone else? And maybe you've read about surrogacy in India, or you've read about surrogacy in Cambodia. I know for a lot of LGBT families, those aren't options anymore. We're really looking at Canada or the United States for the most part. And the idea is, in Canada, the people who are choosing to be surrogates, they're very much, their socioeconomic realities are not so different than yours, okay? So generally what I'm seeing are stay-at-home moms or people who are nurses or early childhood educators, a lot of people who already self-identify as being in the helping role. And I guess the reason I want to talk about this so much, and I want you to focus on this, is this relationship is what makes surrogacy in Canada so special, okay? Because someone's doing this, they don't need to do this. It's not going to change their life in any way. They're not now able to send their child to school or anything like that. They're doing it because they want a fulfilling experience. They want to do something helpful for someone else. So let them know for certain. The other thing is I want you to think about how collaborative that process has to be. So if you've seen a lawyer another time in your life, and you probably have when you're buying a property or getting a job, there's like, to some extent, you're kind of against each other, right? Like you're trying to get an advantage, someone else is trying to get an advantage. You have to kind of take a step back when you're looking at surrogacy and deal with it differently. The idea here is we're collaboratively building a family. So of course you want to do this securely and safely for you and for your child, but you also want this to be a positive experience and help the relationship instead of hurt the relationship with the people who are kind enough to offer to help you. So the most important thing, of course, is what Cindy talked about, who is a parent. Ontario allows, and I love Ontario's legislation in terms of allowing just intention-based parentage and multi-parent families. It's, the idea is who is a parent is really up to who wants to be a parent in advance. But you've got to be very clear. We talk about financial considerations. There's a lot to talk about there. I can't go into all that detail now. The idea is you can reimburse a surrogate for whatever it costs her in Canada. And there's currently no very strict legislation. There's no regulations actually right now in force about what you can. But you cannot compensate her. You just can't payment. We talk about, generally we're pushing single embryo transfers. We talk about things like, does she want obstetrical care? Does she want a midwife? Does she want to give birth in a hospital? Which hospital, et cetera, those kind of information. We also talk about some really tough things, like how do we feel about things like abortion? How do we feel about things like selective reduction if necessary? We do place some restrictions on the surrogate, but they're never to be mean. Things like travel restrictions are really, the idea is, as Cindy was saying before, it matters where the baby's born. We don't accidentally want this baby to be born in Michigan because someone went shopping over the border, where suddenly, and like, you know, I like to go shopping too, but the point being that suddenly, you know, no one has insurance in Michigan. Michigan law is very different than our law. Michigan law specifically allows a surrogate just to keep a baby, no questions asked. So we're never doing anything to hurt someone, we're just trying to keep everyone safe. I'm going to end now because I have lots more to say.
Josh, before you start, I just want to clarify what Sarah said about no regulations. I think it's important to address something that happened yesterday. Health Canada, it published proposed regulations in the Gazette that do deal with the reimbursements, and there's a 75-day period to have roundtable discussions, make submissions to them, which our firm will be very busy dealing with to clarify some things. For the most part, it's what we do already, but there needs to be some clarification, and if and when they ever publish them in Part 2 of the Gazette, they will be the regulations that we will have to follow in contracts. So when choosing a lawyer, make sure that you keep in touch with those changes with your lawyer and with your agency as well.
So Josh was kind enough to give me another moment. So I'm going to jump in here for one more moment and really quick talk about egg donor contracts. Not everyone, depending on your specific circumstance, will be involved in this, but many people will. And similar to Cindy, I also don't think that known donation is legally risky in Canada. And I think before, a lot of my clients actually start with me before they have an agency, before they have a clinic, and just early on because just the way it is. But even if you don't, the take-home message I want you to have if you're looking for an egg donor is think right now whether you want a known donor or an anonymous donor, because if you find like your perfect donor and she's anonymous and you're like, wait, that makes sense to me, why I would want that information, you're not necessarily going to be able to change. So think about it now. And when we're dealing with a known donor, I'll tell you for me why I like known donors so much. And it's the information that your donor is giving your doctor right now up until the time she has a retrieval. I'm really quite confident that she's being honest and getting all the information she has to give. But that ends that day, right? So if you truly want further information in the future, your child may or may not care, but may want access to that donor. And for me, it's really the medical information that I want in the future. Yes, it's true, you can build into an anonymous contract, information being shared through a clinic, information being shared through an agency, but you're relying on people who aren't part of that contract. They may or may not exist in the future. So it's not a right or wrong decision. I have lots and lots of clients who choose anonymous donors too, but think about it before you go forward. And again, I'll let you go. Yeah, I go. Oh, do you want me to contact? I can talk forever.
Could I just add to it, the proposed regulations on keeping records for clinics for donors will only provide that they must keep the identity information for 10 years. And as I said, I have a child turning 10. If I didn't know my donor, I'd want to get those records somehow because things happen in the future. And if they happen, it might be after 10 years.
Thanks, guys. I don't intend to be too long. I don't know how many Americans are in the room.
A few.
There's a few. I'm an American. I grew up in New York. I moved to Canada in 2004. I also practice in Atlantic Canada. Terry Shepard in the back of the room is the fertility law specialist at our firm. We're about 60 lawyers. We're based in Halifax. I'm here just to speak on when your baby is born, as Cindy said, at the back end of the journey, and if it's a Canadian surrogate and you're the American donor and you're traveling back to the US with your child, what you may encounter. As you know, you see the news, President Trump has changed a bit and has made it a lot more difficult at the border right now. The scrutiny is very high, even for Canadians traveling into the US. So I'm just going to briefly just touch on a few things. Immigrating to the US, it's all governed by the Immigration and Nationality Act. An infant acquires US citizenship if the father is an American citizen. There's a blood relationship between the father and the infant. The child is legitimated in the country in which it's born, and the father acknowledges the paternity. In Canada, that's very easy because we file certificates of live birth, and you get a birth certificate. At that time, you'll have the father US donor, and you'll have the surrogate mother on the birth certificate at that time. Once the child is born, the American donor father should report that birth to the nearest US consulate or embassy. You can fill out paperwork called Certificate of Live Birth. What that does is the US consulate or embassy will issue a birth certificate to you, and it says birth brought aboard. aboard. Abroad, sorry. Thank you. And that would be your birth certificate as if you were born in the U.S., and you can apply for a Social Security card and the rest of the documentation. To travel back to the U.S. with your child, you cannot travel by air unless you have a passport, period. So that may take 8 weeks to, a couple months to go through getting all the documentation, getting your infant photographs, applying for the birth certificate. Would recommend, if you want to go back to the States after the child is born, you travel by car or sea, most likely car. A passport's not required. What we would ask is you have a birth certificate issued by the province in which you're from, as well as, and that would be the long form birth certificate. I think they're the same in Ontario.
Yeah, well, you get three, if I could just interject.
Sure.
You get, in Ontario, 3 types of the same birth certificate. The long form one, the parental that has your names as the parents, and the short one, which does not have your names, just the child's. And you can take the parental or the long form one to any passport office. I think if I want to clarify that Josh was talking about 8 weeks possibly for that American one. In the Canadian passport, you can get within 1 day in any major city. Here in Toronto, the emergency passport office, which is really busy at Christmas when everyone forgets they don't have a passport. 3 hours, we've had clients get their Canadian passport. So you could fly with that into America. But to wait for the American passport is going to the American embassy here. That may take a while. We'll do Q&A in a few minutes if it's okay.
Yeah, just 1 second. So as Cindy said, so you need your long form birth certificate. It has to issue the parents, both the birth father and the mother. And then you would get a statutory declaration from the mother to travel back, and just saying you're traveling back to the U.S. Once you're in the U.S., then you already have the birth certificate, and you can go through the process of registering the birth in any particular state in which you live. If, however, you want to travel without the birth certificate and you want to go back immediately, and as Cindy and Sarah can talk probably a little bit more on this, but you can get a letter from a hospital. The doctor who delivered the baby will have to sign the letter. It has to have the child's name, or it has to have the time, place of birth, and both parents' names. That can also be utilized at the border. But there may be some difficulty. I know there have been some issues at the border with just having a letter from the hospital and not having the birth certificate and the stat dec. I leave that to whatever crossing you're going to. Each border agent, as you all know, when you travel, is judge, jury, executioner on anything you want to do. So it all depends on the individual you meet with. I'd love to say there are hard and fast rules that you can all adhere to. There are not. So the letter in some instances may be more than enough to cross the border. At this day and age, I would recommend you wait a couple weeks and wait for the birth certificate to be issued and have the stat dec, so you don't have an issue, considering if you're driving, at least where we are, it's a 5.5-hour drive to Calais from Halifax. I know it's a lot closer here in Ontario, but so you could try, and if you run into an issue, return and deal with it. If you have any issue at the border, I recommend you don't get into it with the border agent. You turn around, go back, contact your lawyer. We will help. Normally it's processing, it's paperwork, it's a T wasn't crossed, an I not dotted, and we can deal with it. But do not get into it at the border with the agent. If they issue an order barring you entry, then you're into the administrative side of the system, and you don't want that.
Yeah. Josh and Terry and I had clients who just got back. Their baby was born a little while ago, 3.5 weeks in Nova Scotia. Terry did the birth registration. Josh assisted with the immigration. They were able to fly home with their little boy. Unfortunately, they can't be here because he's just such a new baby. But it was pretty smooth. And we also love to have our clients tell us when they're planning, especially driving over the border. So got my cell phone handy if there's any kind of problem with border officers. But we don't have it, really.
Thank
All right.
Thank you, guys. So unfortunately, we don't have that many. If you have questions for the lawyers, because of the abbreviated, because of our abbreviated format today, we don't have really question time. I do want to ask one quick question. Well, I'm going to ask. I'm hoping that this is also a question I've had.
Right.
Here in
Because of those shoes
Ontario,
on
we
for
both both parents get on the birth certificate automatically. But I know from if you come back to the States that the other parent has to adopt. What happens here in Canada if the biological dad, you're on the birth certificate? Do you have more rights if you were going to get divorced later?
It's a great question. So you're recognized.
Not that you're getting divorced, any of you.
Yeah, we just don't allow it at our firm. So because you're recognized as parents and you've been raising this child together, the same family law rules should apply in terms of protecting the best interests of the child, which is pretty much the standard in virtually every court across the country. And I should just point out, in the states, the laws are state by state regulated, so it's not in every state that there's a step-parent adoption. And in most cases, it's done fairly quickly. Even for those in New York, we're asked to do a court order that's used by the attorney in the state of New York to do the step-parent adoption so that the other can be recognized. In some states, it's pretty easy, just with the Canadian birth certificate.
Something that's really cool about Ontario and British Columbia law is really, I don't think if there's two dads, I don't really think the genetic dad has anything over the dad who's not genetic. So that's something that's really, really special here, and that's not necessarily the same other places. For those who are American, I'm so sorry with your president, I really am. And I will tell you, a lot of my clients, and I don't want to speak for anyone else, although I would imagine people's situations are very similar, a lot of my clients who probably wouldn't have bothered getting a court order anymore because they would have said our birth certificate is just fine according to Ontario law, you're equal parents, you don't need anything else, in light of the current political state, are choosing to do anything they can to secure everyone's parentage, not from a Canadian perspective, but depending on where they live in the United States.
Yeah.
Okay, well that's good to hear. I was just happy. That's what I thought, but I never had asked that question
My
before.
husband wouldn't dare claim to be the parent in our family.
All right, guys. Thank you guys very much, by the way.